Indomitable Heart by Renette. Chapter 9. The High Council's displeasure at Obi-Wan regarding both his marriage and his contracting mercenary forces to complete his mission on Naboo meant that he was placed on his first probation as a knight when he finally returned to Coruscant. He could understand how his actions were seen as a conflict of interest. His placement as a Jedi mediator had resulted in a lucrative contract for his clan. He had a bit harder of a time filing that as wrong, especially as Queen Amidala and the Naboo had no complaints. Someone always profited. On Naboo, the best interests of the Naboo people, the expulsion of the Trade Federation, happened to result in a profitable campaign for the hot Mando'a. His friends praised him affectionately on earning himself a probation, and his master calmed with congratulations on pissing off the council badly enough that they'd come Dooku to complain. Evidently, they all viewed it as a rite of passage rather than a serious punishment. He was grounded to the temple for a few standard months and placed on a teaching rotation. Suddenly, Obi-Wan felt he had a deeper understanding as to why some of his instructors had been so grumpy, if teaching was commonly used as a probationary period punishment. Despite that he was being punished and rather against his own expectations, Obi-Wan ended up enjoying his time as an instructor. The children were engaging and rather more endearing than he remembered from the rare times Master Dooku had been prevailed upon to teach and promptly roped Obi-Wan into assisting him. They were full of questions about the Beskar he wore every day, even in the temple, which led to questions about the Mando culture and Mando space. Seeing an opportunity to help ease some of the historic antipathy between Jedi and Mando'a, Obi-Wan was happy to educate them, so long as it didn't eat into their official class time. It was nice to catch up with his friends as well. All of his crushmates had been knighted, and Quinlan, who was the first to have his braid severed, actually had a padawan of his own. Ayla was a fierce Twi'lek teenager who tagged along at Quin's shoulder. She was eager to learn and to tease her master at any given opportunity. Evidently, she'd picked up a lot of interesting these phrases relating to sex on their most recent mission to Tatooine and was pestering Quinn to explain what they meant. Ayla also spent a lot of time in the creche mentoring one of the initiates. While on Tatooine, Ayla and Quinlan had somewhat inadvertently emancipated a young Force-sensitive boy and his mother from slavery. Fearing he might be forced back into bondage, Quinn and Ayla had acceded to the mother's demands that the boy, Anakin Skywalker, be brought to the temple. While incredibly strong in the Force, Skywalker was much older than most younglings dedicated to the Jedi. It made things awkward for him in the creche, where he was the same age as the initiates preparing to become padawans, but years behind them in formal education. Ayla, who had also come a bit older to the creche, spent much of her spare time tutoring Skywalker in reading Ori'vod and learning basic Force exercises. She seemed to enjoy teaching the younger boy, and he learned well from her, without the attendant anxieties of failing someone he had to address as master. Quinlan teased her that she'd have to earn a knighthood in record time if she wanted to be Skywalker's official mentor. Obi-Wan finally got to meet Skywalker himself after about a month in temple. While behind in some skills and knowledge sets, Anakin was astoundingly advanced in other areas. Obi-Wan was teaching a flight mechanics course more advanced than the basic piloting that most initiates undertook, and when Anakin tested out of those basic courses, he joined Obi-Wan's class. More of Obi-Wan's other students were Padawans already, all of them adolescent. Anakin, not yet 10 years old by his own best guess, and scrawny from years of malnourishment, stood out like a sore thumb. Obi-Wan was all too familiar with the bullying that could develop in such a situation and carefully watched over the interactions in the classroom. To Obi-Wan's surprise, the Padawans exceeded his rather low expectations. Instead of taking out their frustrations at being bested by an initiate on Anakin, the Padawans adopted him as a mascot and pestered him for piloting tips. In exchange for his racing knowledge, the Padawans tutored him in his other classes. It seemed at least a couple of the older students had strong behind-the-scenes encouragement from Ayla, who remained fond of the boy. Despite the formation of those new acquaintanceships, Ayla retained her place as Anakin's closest friend and primary tutor while she was in the temple. which meant that when Obi-Wan spent time with Quinn, Ayla and Anakin were often near at hand, bickering and teasing one another in a pidgin of Hatiz, Ril, Bosch, and Basic. It was surprisingly comfortable and underlined to Obi-Wan just how lonely some of his longer solo missions were. With Dooku, they had operated alone for the most part, and Obi-Wan hadn't questioned that his first few missions were run solo. But he'd also had Jango at his shoulder as often as they could manage it, and even when they couldn't coordinate their missions, they were constantly calming one another. Somewhere along the line, Obi-Wan had forgotten a little how nice it was to be surrounded and supported by other Jedi. The Order could use a few dozen hard looks at itself, Obi-Wan knew that well. But it was still home. "Probation? Really, Obi-Wan?" Jan greeted when he returned to Coruscant a few months after Obi-Wan. He left Devarin to go on a distant mission himself, seeking out a pair of his missing age-mates, Sifo Dyas and Kyr'tayl. "You congratulated me earlier," Obi-Wan teased, then pushed his way into his master's apartment and embraced him, resting his head on Jan's broad shoulder. "Missed you, master. This being a knight nonsense is a lot harder than you ever made it look." Jan chuckled softly, gently carting his fingers through Obi-Wan's shaggy hair. "I've missed you too, my dear boy," Jan admitted. For all he had scolded Qui-Gon about affection being his first Padawan's downfall, it was one of his own weaknesses as well. Affection was half the reason he was so intent on finding Sifo and Kai. Sifo's trail had gone cold, and Jan had set that search aside, although he hoped he'd find another lead in the future. Kai had decided to take his foul-mouthed new Padawan, freed from slavery on Ramikadyc, to the Altesian sect, where she wouldn't stick out quite as badly. Young Asajj Ventress was older even than Anakin Skywalker, and had lived in even harsher environs. "What brings you back to Coruscant?" Obi-Wan asked when he'd made them tea and settled at his master's side on the sofa. Jan let out another rusty chuckle. "Your research, actually," Jan admitted. In addition to his duties as instructor, Obi-Wan had stood before the High Council at least a dozen times in the past months, answering question after question about the pair of Sith he'd dueled on Naboo. At first, no one had been willing to believe that either the Zabrak assassin or the mysterious Darksider was truly a Sith. A reappearance of their ancient enemy after 1,000 years was an ill omen after all. The Shadows had claimed the Zabrak's corpse and all the items found on it, and sent agents to Naboo to see what else could be discovered. Despite not being a Shadow himself, Obi-Wan had insisted upon being included, at least peripherally, in the investigation. There wasn't much that was concrete, but they had circumstantial evidence tying the Zabrak to a number of murders in the criminal underworld. The bleeding red crystals in the double-bladed saber left little doubt as to the Zabrak's nature. When Jedi fell, their original sabers worked for them to an extent, and they were usually captured or killed before they undertook the heresy of forcing an unwilling crystal to obey them. A fallen Jedi likely wouldn't even have the knowledge to attempt such sacrilege. "The Sith?" Obi-Wan asked, and Dooku nodded. While his missions didn't always reflect it, Jan had long ago become an expert on the varying force-using sects in the galaxy, their traditions and methods. He was perhaps one of the most learned scholars the Jedi had on the topic of the practices of the Sith, among other groups. Obi-Wan still remembered quite fondly the few months they'd spent on Jedha in the Temple of Khyber while his master studied with the Guardians there. It was the closest he'd had to a vacation until this probation period. "And how's Jango?" Jan asked, and Obi-Wan's face lit up. While circumstances kept them apart, they spoke regularly. "He's good. You know him. He never slows down," Obi-Wan said fondly. "We're designing Sur'atiin." He touched his temple where the incisions would be made and the ink applied. Most of the design was traditional, to fit within the markings Jango already wore. Obi-Wan would only have his temple marked in honor of their marriage, not having the knowledge of his lineage that was reflected in the rest of the Sur'atiin. While as a knight, Obi-Wan was now permitted to seek out his birth world and family, he had no inclination for such a journey. Jan, Jango, the Jedi, and hot Mando'a. That was all the family Obi-Wan needed. "I was rather surprised you didn't have the Sur'atiin done as soon as you spoke your vows," Jan admitted, fingers tapping against Obi-Wan's upper arm. where he had the Mando'a sigil tattooed when he first got involved with Jango. "We wanted to be certain it was the right step for both of us," Obi-Wan said. "The Sur'atiin is special." Jan nodded, understanding that well enough. The marks were sacred to that Mando'a, nothing to be undertaken lightly. "I also hear you've been hanging about with Initiate Skywalker?" Jan asked, and Obi-Wan flushed. "He's a sweet boy," Obi-Wan said somewhat defensively. "That was neither an accusation nor an insinuation, my dear," Jan soothed gently, becoming aware he'd poked at a spot that was more tender than he'd anticipated. "Has someone been bothering you about it? There are those who think he is too old to be brought to the temple at all, even though he's currently tracked for the service corps, not training as a padawan," Obi-Wan said. "He really is a good boy. He just feels so much, and I think the Crashmasters don't quite know what to do with him at times. The padawans get along with him wonderfully." "Don't over-identify with him, Obi-Wan. His struggles are his own," Jan cautioned. "Yes, Master," Obi-Wan said with a slight flush, dipping his head at the gentle reprimand. "It's true I see a lot of myself in him, though our origins are rather disparate." "Be a guide to him, then. Help him avoid your mistakes," Jan suggested gently. Obi-Wan nodded, relaxing. Jan smiled and began to tell Obi-Wan of his mission to Riduur, finding his old friend Kyr'tayl and Nodic's own unexpected padawan, until Obi-Wan dozed off there on the sofa, his head resting against Jan's shoulder. For the remainder of Obi-Wan's probation, Dooku was in the temple, assisting with the investigation into the Sith, the council finally bowing to Obi-Wan's insistence that both beings he'd fought on Naboo had been Sith, which meant that either they were from the line of Bane, a master or apprentice still out there, or they were from some sect of Sith that the Jedi had never before encountered. Neither prospect was terribly reassuring for the Jedi. They'd either been tricked for a millennia or distressingly unobservant. It especially rankled the masters. Some of the more hidebound counselors would have liked to deny indefinitely that the Sith had survived into the present day and were emerging once more from the shadows. When his probation was over, after about half a year in the temple, Obi-Wan was sent out to scour the Outer Rim in search of more clues on the mysterious Sith. He spoke at length with Quinlan in anticipation of the mission, as his old friend was a Shadow, one of the Jedi who specialized in hunting for traces of the Sith. Obi-Wan also shared what information he could with Jango and the Mando'a before he got on his outpost transport, not sure when he would next be able to get in touch. While the Mando'a had obligations of their own, both as individual bounty hunters and as a mercenary fighting force, they also covered a lot more ground than a single Jedi could. Jango set a time to update the clan, and Obi-Wan, like the others who weren't on the Daybreaker, was there on comms. When Obi-Wan had given the clan the partial briefing on the Sith that he was allowed to share via Holo, Jango stood, looking over his clan members appraisingly. Obi-Wan had already briefed Jango in private, telling him more of the Jedi Order's history with the Sith, and Jango knew his Mando history fairly well too. The Sith were the scourge that had decimated his people long before the Republic came for their pound of flesh. If he had his way, and if his clan agreed, he'd unleash every Mando'a willing on the Demagolkase. But hunting the Sith was not something he would demand. The danger was far too great to make this hunt anything but optional. "Vote," Jango said, and the whispers that had sprung up quieted. "What Obi-Wan has told us will impact the entire galaxy," he said with quiet surety, and some of the others nodded. "History tells us quite clearly what destruction and cruelty the Sith would wreak if left to their own devices, or worse, if they were supported by those who thought only of potential gain. I do not ask any of you to fight or hunt this enemy. The Sith is quarry we have not measured ourselves against, and we don't know what they might be capable of, either in straight battle or through more nefarious means. Know this, though. My husband is as Jedi as he is Mando'a, and his enemies are my enemies. I tell you, I go as a man in hunt for the Sith. I do not ask you to join me, but if you hunt at my side, you will have earned a debt beyond what I could repay in this life." Jango finished. Obi-Wan didn't argue Jango's declaration, but Jango imagined his clever husband had guessed he might do something like this. While Jango's estimation of the Jedi had improved markedly since Yan and Obi-Wan came to Galedran, he still had Amando's reservations about the Order as a whole. "Go me shekemir," Miles called, affirming his loyalty. "Nee shekemir," Silas echoed a moment, his voice overlapping Miles. The rest of the clan pitched in rapid order, declaring themselves against the Sith. Jango's heart swelled with affection and trepidation. Ramikadyc, the lot of them! "Oya!" Jango called, recognizing their pledges, and they began to cheer and ululate, warming their blood for the endeavor. "I should have known," Obi-Wan murmured in Jango's ear via the comm, wishing he could be there in person to scold and support his husband. "Happy hunting, beloved. And if you're in the Arcanist sector, please check in on a woman named Shmi Skywalker in Mos Espa and tell her that her son is growing well in the temple." Jango huffed softly, switching Obi-Wan to his private channel as he pulled on his bouquet. "You taking the kid on?" Jango asked. They discussed the prospect at length when Obi-Wan first started sharing stories about Anakin with Jango a few months before. "Not right now," Obi-Wan said. "He needs more of the basics in the creche, and my missions are too dangerous for a student that young. In a couple years, perhaps, when he can better defend himself, and hopefully we'll have made some progress on the Sith by then, although I'm not holding my breath. He won't age out until he's 13, and someone more experienced may select him before then, which I couldn't begrudge." "Take care of yourself," Jango directed, "if you need backup." "I know you're only a calm away, Riduur," Obi-Wan said affectionately. "And if I need extraction, I will call." "All right," Jango said with a smile, knowing he was being a bit overbearing. His Jedi was a knight, more than capable of looking after himself. That didn't stop Jango from worrying. He knew Obi-Wan worried about him too, though, and while that didn't make things better or easier, it did make it feel a bit more equitable. "Miss you." "Miss you too," Obi-Wan murmured. "I'm hoping I'll be able to see you soon." "You know how to find me," Jango said with a smirk. "By following the trail of death and destruction?" Obi-Wan quipped, and Jango huffed out a soft laugh. They talked a little longer before Obi-Wan had to sign off and go about his business. The next months would provide them little opportunity to converse, although they called one another any chance they were given, and even managed to meet up on Concord Dawn while Jango was in the sector making some repairs and upgrades to his ship's systems and visiting Arla at their family farm. Obi-Wan couldn't stay too long. He was already overdue back on Coruscant at that point. But when he arrived back at the temple, his temple was swollen and lined with glossy black ink that identified him to Mando'a everywhere as Jango's spouse. As a reward for his efforts hunting the Sith, Obi-Wan was granted a bit of time in temple without obligations. He found his master deep in the archives with Master Nu, their silvered heads pressed together over accounts of the Sith Wars that had decimated the Order and all but destroyed the Sith. Dooku looked up, still attuned to Obi-Wan's presence, and Obi-Wan gestured silently, letting his old master know he would find him later to properly say hello. Dooku signed his agreement, then turned back to Madame Nu. Leaving them to their research, Obi-Wan found his way back to his austere billet in the knight's dorms, and happily stood under the sonics until he was fairly certain he cleansed off the entire outer layer of his skin. Obi-Wan ate with Yan that evening, catching one another up. Much of Obi-Wan's reconnaissance would likely end up in Dooku's hands, his tenuous leads on the Sith being carefully researched. Some of Obi-Wan's information would be discarded, but some would hopefully elucidate them on where these Sith had come from and why they had stepped back out from the shadows. For the few weeks he was in the temple, Obi-Wan happily caught up with his friends and spent time in the creche. Anakin was ecstatic to see him, and more so when Obi-Wan relayed word from Jango that Shmi was doing well and had started her own repair business in the free settlement of Anchorhead using funds from a Free Beings microlending collective. Obi-Wan enjoyed spending time with the boy and happily tutored him a bit in lightsaber forms and hand-to-hand combat. The council didn't let Obi-Wan rest too long, though. His information gathering had been among the most productive of the Jedi they had sent out scouring for evidence of the Sith, and they wanted him on the hunt once again. Obi-Wan couldn't fault their reasoning. He was soon on his way, first to a relatively peaceful diplomatic mission to keep his negotiating skills in practice, and then back to Sith hunting. A few months After Obi-Wan started going back out on missions, Jango rescheduled their regular contact. It wasn't the first time one of them had needed a few days' grace to wrap up a mission or contract, so Obi-Wan agreed and bent his attention back to his own duties. Despite that they'd gone longer without contact, when their schedules didn't cooperate, worry seated itself in the back of Obi-Wan's mind. Jango's work was dangerous, but Obi-Wan also knew how capable Jango was. Usually, even if there wasn't time to talk, Jango would still send him a message or two. When that week passed without a single message, the worry began to grow. Obi-Wan forced himself to keep his mind on his duties, despite the anxiety gnawing at his gut. Jango would be fine. He was just busy. The following week, when Obi-Wan contacted Jango, the connection went to the answering service. Nothing was wrong, Obi-Wan told himself fiercely. Jango was just busy or had broken his comm or something. It wouldn't be the first time one of them damaged their equipment. All the same, Obi-Wan had put the codes for the Daybreaker. "Miles?" Obi-Wan asked when instead of the general frequency, he was rerouted to Miles' personal comm. "I've been meaning to comm you," Miles said grimly. "Jango took an individual contract a couple weeks ago, not long after you two last spoke by the comm logs." "I take it he hasn't reported in?" "No." Miles grit out, sounding personally offended by the fact I sent a scout to the last location his ship paid docking fees when he missed his usual weekly check-in. "We found Jester's legacy abandoned on Kolmama, one of the many moons of Bogdan. We also found the body and ship of that Hutton Montrose. I haven't been the best at keeping in touch while trying to track Jango down." Obi-Wan grimaced at that, knowing how single-tracked Miles could get when he was working on something. Montrose was no friend to Jango. He had been one of the Mando'a under the leadership of Jasta Mareel, but after Mareel's death, Montrose had tried more than once to kill Jango and take over leadership of the Mando'a. While few, if any, would be sad to hear of Montrose's death, it was worrying to find evidence of Jango having been on Kalma, but no Jango himself. "Ola?" Obi-Wan asked. Her last text message had been a bit stiff, but Obi-Wan hadn't connected it to Jango's lack of contact. Mentally, he counted back. Jango had been perhaps a day or two missing when he'd last contacted Arla. She'd likely been worried, but probably hadn't known the worst of it yet. Obi-Wan would have to give her a comm when he finished with Miles. "She hasn't heard from him either," Miles confirmed. "I've updated her. She isn't taking it well." Obi-Wan gritted his teeth and reminded himself that Jango was more than capable of looking after himself. Still, the worry didn't ease. "The rest of the clan?" "Worried. Jango left Silas and I in charge, as he usually does when he takes a solo contract. So far, there hasn't been any trouble with the clan. We'll have a full briefing soon, and likely Silas or I will take temporary command. For now, Silas is concentrating on the day-to-day business, while I focus on finding Jango. And we will find him, that I promise." Obi-Wan swallowed thickly. He wasn't going to panic, he reminded himself. Sometimes a mission required that one of them remain out of touch for a month or more. Still, he couldn't help but remember some of the close calls over the past few years. First, the first time they'd met, Jango had been patching himself up after a run-in with Death Watch. This wasn't the clan wars, Obi-Wan told himself. Jango had an excellent reputation in the bounty hunting community for a reason. He was smart and skilled, and he was going to be fine. Obi-Wan reiterated that last point to himself more firmly. Jango was going to be fine. Still, the timing looked more than a little suspicious. Less than a year after declaring a hunt on the Sith, Jango went missing without word to his spouse, sworn clanmates, or blood sibling? None of them could believe Jango would disappear so thoroughly, not without cause. They would continue the hunt, searching for the Sith and Jango both, until they had either Jango back alive or solid proof of death. "Keep me appraised, or will," Miles promised. When he closed the connection, Obi-Wan crumpled in on himself, taking deep breaths. Steady. He had to be steady now. If he lost himself in the threatening worry and fear, he'd be no help in finding Jango. In, out. Slowly, he tamped down the panic and reached out in the Force, wondering why he hadn't noticed something was wrong. The Force had grown shadowed and sluggish in the past years, and while subsuming himself in that energy bestowed a comfort, the feeling of unease had grown so prevalent it was hard to distinguish specifics Once he calmed himself enough to think straight, Obi-Wan sent a text message to Miles, full of all the questions he should have asked over the comm. The response came so quickly, Obi-Wan guessed Miles had likely already begun writing the message after they ended their conversation, with so much left unsaid. Miles wrote that Lorne was going through the logs on Jaster's legacy, and Miles himself was tracking down the origination of the contract Jango had been on. From the logs, they thought Jango had arrived at Kalma on schedule shortly before his and Obi-Wan's rescheduled contact, and gone missing shortly thereafter. Silas was going to temporarily take over the business of the clan, while Miles focused, with a team of others, on finding Jango. When he had a better idea of what was being done, Obi-Wan sent Arla a quick text. "I just talked with Miles. How are you holding up?" Obi-Wan sent. "Bad!" Arla texted back almost immediately. The standard animation that showed when someone was typing popped up and stayed up for a few seconds that seemed to stretch an eternity. "I know Death Watch is gone. I know it's not them," she texted. "But that doesn't help," Obi-Wan sent. "Doesn't help at all," Arla sent back, along with the symbol of a frowning face. "Miles is keeping me up to date. Told my counselor yesterday. We're working on keeping me calmish." "We'll find him," Obi-Wan promised. "Or tear the galaxy apart looking," Arla sent back. "And," Obi-Wan replied, "and tear the galaxy apart looking." He received a small mythosaur skull, the symbol of the Mandalorian return. "Always willing to talk," Obi-Wan sent, and this time Arla texted him back a simple smile. Obi-Wan walked around in a daze for a week before earning a reprimand from the Battle Master when he nearly wandered into the middle of a training session. He forced himself to be more present in the here and now after that. He wouldn't be able to help Jango or anyone else if he was stuck in his own head. Still, Obi-Wan beat himself up for months, even as he forced himself to focus on his missions. He knew that few, if any, Jedi would care one way or the other about Jango's disappearance, save that it might affect Obi-Wan's performance as a member and representative of the Order. Which meant that if Obi-Wan was going to get any leeway to look for Jango, and he refused to accept the suggestion that he give up, write his husband off as dead, he had to continue to perform admirably as a Jedi. The rest of the hot Mando'a were just as stubborn, or perhaps just as in denial, while they accepted that in theory they might find proof of death rather than Jango alive and pissed off. All were intent on finding their Mandalore. After all, if Jango was dead, someone would likely be bragging very loudly about it, given Jango's reputation and position. Jaster's legacy provided few clues, other than a few messages. In the months after Jango's disappearance, Miles tracked down everyone who had contacted Jango. Most were professional acquaintances, and word spread through the bounty hunting community quickly that Jango was missing and the hot Mando'a were on the warpath, their Jedi occasionally with them. Those few leads soon petered out, though. Jango had disappeared, and no one was sure how or where he had gone. For the next few years, Obi-Wan remained on far-flung missions hunting Jango and the Sith alongside his Mando brethren whenever possible. When he was hunting either criminals or traces of Jango, the fear and grief receded, if only a little. Missions kept Obi-Wan from falling apart. If he was out in the galaxy, there was a chance he would see something, hear some rumor of Jango. Only Dooku could reliably pull him home to Coruscant, although some of Obi-Wan's age mates were at least sympathetic about his loss. Quinn more than once dragged Obi-Wan out of the Sunrise Step Cafe in Little Kaldame, where the sympathetic bartenders were apt to let Obi-Wan drink himself stupid. It was Dooku, though, who called Obi-Wan to the temple as Anakin approached his 13th birthday. While the boy had originally been steered toward the service corps, he more than made up the deficits in his education due to being born enslaved and coming to the temple so late, and should a knight or master offer to him, the council was likely to allow Anakin to train as a knight. Jan knew that Obi-Wan was fond of the boy and hoped that by suggesting a partnership between them, Anakin would help Obi-Wan feel less isolated from the Order. Obi-Wan resisted, if only because Jan's reasoning sounded uncomfortably like the logic master Yoda had applied to push Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon Jinn together. He hesitated too when the grief was stronger. Raising warriors was something he and Jango were supposed to do together. But Obi-Wan didn't enjoy spending time with Anakin and could easily see the generous and gifted knight Anakin might become with training. In the end, it was the happier memories of Jango that decided Obi-Wan. Their late-night talks curled up together discussing the warriors they would raise. Jango's amusement when Obi-Wan related his time spent with Anakin. Even in the creche, Anakin had heard about Obi-Wan's marriage and missing husband. Most of the Jedi seemed to think that Obi-Wan's long absences from the temple were worrying, that there was something un-Jedi-like about Obi-Wan wanting to find his husband. Anakin didn't quite understand that. He had worried so much about his mom back on Tatooine, and knowing she was safe and free had made him so much happier. Knowing his husband was safe would make Obi-Wan happier, and that seemed like a good thing to Anakin. It took Anakin a little longer to realize that the marriage itself was part of what many Jedi thought strange about Obi-Wan's search. While Anakin knew most Jedi didn't marry, he hadn't thought much about the reasons why. Obi-Wan's marriage had only ever seemed to make him happy. He never asked special favors, at least not that Anakin had heard of, and he still went on missions and helped people at the Council's direction. Even with his husband missing, Obi-Wan was still doing his job. But Obi-Wan, Anakin also understood, was a bit of a special case. As the slayer of the first Sith in a millennia, Obi-Wan was something of a celebrity in the temple, especially among the initiates and younger padawans. They were also more than a little surprised by the fact that Obi-Wan, as the only Jedi who wore full body armor every day, complete with domed and T-slit helmet. Evidently, the Beskar god made him look cool. As a knight without a Padawan, Obi-Wan was also closely watched by the under-13 crowd, and the fact that Anakin knew him was valuable credit for Anakin. More importantly to Anakin, though, Obi-Wan was his friend, and someone else who had struggled on their path to becoming a Jedi Knight. He was kind and willing to help Anakin with his blade work, and reassured him that the Force, while not exactly a sentient entity, worked toward the light. Sometimes, as his 13th birthday approached, it was hard for Anakin to accept that. For all that he'd never anticipated becoming a Padawan, Anakin was disappointed that he would soon leave the temple for the service corps. Like all initiates who didn't become Padawans, Anakin would go to the Agra Corps at first to receive some additional training. He was hoping he ended up in the Explorer Corps in the end. Charting the unknown regions and wild space sounded terribly fun if he couldn't become a knight and help people that way. He would miss his friends, Anakin thought, stomping down the curl of longing that grew in his chest every time he thought too hard about his future. But there was something slightly different about the way he felt when he thought about not being at Obi-Wan's side, not learning from him anymore. Wanting to see as much as possible of Obi-Wan before he left the temple, Anakin assured that every time Obi-Wan returned to Coruscant, they spent time together. Sometimes that time was spent just sitting and eating together, Anakin talking about his classes. Other times, Obi-Wan would take Anakin out into the city, usually to the nearest Mando enclave, where Obi-Wan would talk to his contacts about possible sightings of the Mandalore, and Anakin would listen carefully to brush up on his Mando'a. Anakin liked best, though, when he could get Obi-Wan to tutor him, even teaching him force techniques or practicing lightsaber forms. "You're progressing well," Obi-Wan complimented one day as Anakin's birthday approached. Anakin smiled brightly with joy at the praise. While he enjoyed his classmates with the Battle Master, one-on-one training with Obi-Wan was so much better. "I've been practicing hard," Anakin admitted. "The Masters say I could be a Padawan if someone chose me. But I don't think anyone will," he confessed. "Everyone knows I came late to the Order and that I'm not as trained as the other initiates my age." Obi-Wan could hear the thread of disappointment in Anakin's tones and knew it well. While Obi-Wan had become something like a confidant for the younger Jedi and advised him about possible paths, the two Jedi themselves had never actually brought up the prospect of Obi-Wan taking Anakin as his Padawan. Obi-Wan wasn't certain why in hindsight. Anakin had always been an excellent pupil for him, although there was more to the mentor and apprentice relationship than that. "About that," Obi-Wan said, and Anakin looked up, hope blooming in his bright blue eyes. Like all initiates, he'd hoped to be chosen as a Padawan. And Obi-Wan, he was the ideal teacher for half of Anakin's creche mates. "I'd be honored," To guide you on the path to knighthood, Initiate Skywalker. You! Really? You! Anakin asked excitedly, visibly trembling in anticipation. Really? Really? Obi-Wan said, and promptly had an armful of sobbing boy. I have you now, Adika, he murmured into Anakin's curling ash blonde hair, rubbing soothing circles into the narrow back packed with sturdy muscle. Udesi, Ori'vod is here now, he promised. Ori'vod, Anakin mumbled, and Obi-Wan nodded, finger-combing Anakin's curls and gently separating out a section where a padawan braid would be plaited. I promise to uphold the Jedi code. Anakin mumbled theorily the first line of the padawan vows. Shh, that will wait until we go before the council, Obi-Wan soothed. I know you'll do well, Andika. Anakin nodded his agreement and clung to Obi-Wan a while longer. Without letting go, Obi-Wan tapped a request to be seen by the council into the comm on his gauntlet. Rather to his surprise, he received an almost immediate reply that he could be seen that same day, just before the council ended their business for the evening. That was quick, Obi-Wan said aloud and shifted Anakin in his arms to show him the appointment. Looks like we'll be official tonight. Anakin beamed wetly up at Obi-Wan at that, sheer joy pulsing off him so strongly, Obi-Wan couldn't help but laugh with reflected delight. Would you like to meditate with me before that? Obi-Wan asked, and Anakin made a face, but nodded. Obi-Wan chuckled softly. Let's clean up first then, Padawan, he encouraged, and Anakin's brilliant grin returned as he raced for the showers, practically skipping with joy. The two of them meditated in the star map room, one of Obi-Wan's favorite places in the temple for contemplation when it wasn't in use for other purposes. They fell into sync quickly and easily, and Obi-Wan felt replete in the Force in a way he hadn't in years. Anakin's light was impossibly bright, joyously bursting forth from within him like a newborn star. This was the right path, Obi-Wan felt, more sure of that than he had been of anything in what felt like years. Anakin was his to train, and while they didn't fall spontaneously into a bond, Obi-Wan had to exert some effort to prevent that. While not bound by tradition, he did want to honor some of the old customs, like not bonding to his Padawan or braiding his hair until the pairing had been approved by the council. Expect you! Your master said we should, Yoda greeted Obi-Wan when he arrived in the council chamber, Anakin's hand clasped warmly in his. I should have known, Obi-Wan grumbled fondly, then dipped his head in solemn greeting to the councilors. Honored masters, I petition for your approval to take Initiate Skywalker as my Padawan learner, he said more formally. The Force encourages our bonding, and Initiate Skywalker has given his approval of my request to guide him on the path to knighthood. This is the path you wish to follow, Initiate Skywalker, Mace Windu asked in his stern but kind way. Over the years, Anakin had lost much of his initial fear of the counselors and begun to understand that it wasn't him they feared, but the uncertainty in his future, an uncertainty that roiled in the Force and cast shadows over what was to come. It is, masters, Anakin said. Knight Kenobi has been an excellent mentor even without the advantage of a bond. The Force is guiding me to his side. Obi-Wan smiled, knowing his new Padawan had likely been practicing that little speech since accepting Obi-Wan's offer. Pleased we are to welcome you, Padawan Skywalker, Yoda said, ears flickering with affection. It was no secret that the ancient master was fond of Obi-Wan, and a new Padawan would keep the young knight in the temple more often rather than chasing dangerous rumors of Jango fed through the Outer Rim. Your vows you will take. Anakin nodded and knelt facing Yoda, the ritual words springing to mind. I promise to uphold the Jedi Code, Anakin began. I promise to respect all life and to help those weaker than myself, to use the Force only for good, never draw my lightsaber in anger, only to defend those who cannot defend themselves, to find new ways to improve myself so that I may be an example to others, and to defend the Galactic Republic. He swore. Ni kyr'tayl, Oya Anakin Skywalker, Obi-Wan said softly the Mando words of brotherly adoption before he began weaving Anakin's Padawan braid. Obi-Wan couldn't help but think of Olarom as he spoke the words, the night Jango had included him in the clan, and the sweet kisses they had shared by the fire's light. His heart ached, wondering when his husband and new charge would get to meet. "The mentor, the padawan, and the force entwined," he intoned, deftly braiding Anakin's short hair and tying it off. It was a little stub of a thing now, but when Obi-Wan plaited it properly, he would braid in some of his own hair to lengthen it. "May the force be with you," the counselors said almost in unison. "May the force be with you," Obi-Wan returned, Anakin echoing him a beat later. Laying his hand on Anakin's shoulder, Obi-Wan guided him from the council chambers. They went next to the offices of the Council of Reassignment to fill in the appropriate forms, including housing reassignments and supply requests. Obi-Wan also filled in a form to have a droid move his few belongings from his knight's billet to their new quarters once they were assigned. It was nearly late meal by the time they finished, so they ate in the refectory, then went to collect Anakin's few things from the creche. While they packed up his belongings, the message came through on Obi-Wan's comm, letting him know where their new quarters were, and that his own possessions would be delivered shortly. Once packed, Anakin said his goodbyes to his creche mates and received their enthusiastic congratulations before the knight and his new padawan went to find their new shared quarters. The apartment had likely been unlived in for some time. The sense of the last occupants faded to nothing. The cleaning droids at least had been through, scouring away the dust that would have collected while the rooms stood empty. Basic furniture sat in the common areas and bedrooms, and Anakin was soon unpacking his things from the crush, a few model ships he'd assembled, pictures he'd drawn, and datapads he'd accumulated. Obi-Wan settled his own belongings, the rack for his armor and the tools he used to maintain it and his weapons, his own datapads and spare comm, the detritus of his field kit. A droid arrived from the quartermaster before long, with linens and necessities like dishes and cutlery. Obi-Wan contemplated growing a few plants from cuttings in the gardens, but decided they'd find out what their schedule was first. In the past few years, anything but a cactus would have died from neglect under his dubious care. It took a few weeks for Obi-Wan and Anakin to settle into their new routine and get used to living together. While Obi-Wan was an early riser by habit and didn't mind getting up as the sky was still brightening, Anakin had to be dragged from bed with promises of food. Once fed, Anakin became a bit more alert, and Obi-Wan ensured they built the habit of meditating then, before Anakin was fully awake and asking questions. Where Obi-Wan had quiet confidence, Anakin was all brash curiosity, sometimes badgering for answers Obi-Wan didn't have. Although sometimes awkward, the incessant questions spurred needed conversations that helped them learn more about one another and strengthen their bond. Anakin loved hearing stories about Obi-Wan's missions, and Obi-Wan found that telling those stories became another way of teaching, sharing his mistakes and pointing them out, guiding Anakin to come up with other solutions that might have worked better. As much in self-defense as anything, Obi-Wan taught Anakin advanced research skills early on so he could send him to the archives with his never-ending questions. Madame Nu was alternately pleased and dismayed. Some days Obi-Wan had half a dozen messages from her, varying from compliments on his curious student to demands he remove Anakin from the archives immediately. The latter was usually when Anakin's questions veered into uncomfortable territory about the structure of the Republic and the Jedi's place within that structure, where those with friends in the Senate were prioritized for Jedi assistance when things went wrong. On days when Anakin had classes, Obi-Wan had duties of his own. He was finishing his teaching rotation and also doing research on the Sith. Obi-Wan was certain their reappearance and Jango's disappearance were somehow linked. The one lesson of Anakin's that Obi-Wan took over from the start was lightsaber combat. While he wouldn't claim to be as skilled as the Battlemaster, Obi-Wan knew Anakin learned well with individual attention. Training Anakin also gave them more time to practice together and would allow Anakin to learn how to work with Obi-Wan's style of fighting. At the end of the first week, Obi-Wan calmed the Daybreaker to introduce Anakin to the clan. Silas picked up and gave Obi-Wan his usual thin smile before the expression got a little happier to see the youngling standing at Obi-Wan's side and near vibrating with excitement. "Sukui," Obi-Wan greeted, seeing Silas's slightly knowing expression. "Ibic near Adiga, Anakin Skywalker. Olarom." Silas said in welcome. "Ni kyr'tayl guy, Anakin Skywalker." Obi-Wan smiled at the acknowledgement. It was a simple phrase, but it echoed the formal Mando adoption rites, and Obi-Wan was certain Silas did that on purpose. Anakin, this is Silas Kell, one of my brothers, Obi-Wan introduced in turn. So cuy'gar, Anakin said carefully, and Silas grinned. Good choice, Obi-Wan, Silas said. Give me a minute, I'll get Miles and some of the others to say hello. Obi-Wan nodded. Arla joined the comm first, and Obi-Wan could see the weariness in the shadow beneath her dark eyes. Arla, Obi-Wan greeted. This is Anakin Skywalker, my new padawan. She smiled, her chin wobbling slightly. Hey, Arla started, then paused, turning away and swallowing thickly. He would be so happy, Obi-Wan knew she wanted to say, and so he nodded again, hands tightening briefly on Anakin's shoulders. I know he'd be pleased, Obi-Wan said gently, and I'll do my best to ensure that Anakin knows our ways. Arla nodded, eyes bright with unshed tears. Her hands flashed. Miss you, Arla sighed, not wanting to speak for fear she wouldn't get the words out over her tears. See soon. A moment later, her signal blinked out. Obi-Wan, Anakin asked quietly. Arla is Jango's sister, but she can't really leave Concord Dawn, Obi-Wan said. We all miss Jango so much, and he and I had talked about training students. The whole clan knows Jango should be here to help introduce you to them and help teach you the raison d'être. Why can't Arla leave Concord Dawn? Anakin asked, and Obi-Wan sighed. I'll explain later, Obi-Wan said as Silas walked back into range of the holotransmitter with Miles and Ruusan Rook at his shoulder. Sukui, Obi-Wan greeted and went through introductions again. A few more Mando'a came through to greet Anakin before they had to close the call. All were welcoming, but the undercurrent of sadness was ever present. They all knew as Arla did that this was a task Obi-Wan had meant to undertake with Jango. I think I've told you about how Jango came to join the Hot Mando'a, right? Obi-Wan asked that night as he checked over his armor and Anakin read over an assignment. Anakin nodded, setting aside his datapad. And that he thought Arla was killed with their parents. Anakin nodded again. But she was taken captive instead, Anakin said. Obi-Wan dipped his head. While she was captive, the people who had her hurt her badly, Obi-Wan explained, knowing he was glossing over what had been done, but also knowing the details weren't his to share. Sometimes when we get hurt, our minds start seeing danger where other people don't. Because of how badly she was hurt, Arla only feels safe in a few places. Anakin nodded slowly. It was sort of like how he'd only ever felt safe when he was with his mom, before he'd got used to the temple and learned the Jedi were safe. Sometimes he still got nervous when his clan from the Krish went on field trips in the city, before he remembered he was allowed to look people in the eyes, allowed to be loud and have fun like any other youngling. After that conversation, Obi-Wan sat Anakin down and began teaching him the raison d'être, the 6 core tenets Mando'a upheld at the heart of their culture. Bajure, or education, the promise to teach younglings the Mando way. Beskargam, or armor, the wearing of the iron skin that not only protected the Mando'a but streamlined the appearance of the many species who made up the culture. Arenov, or self-defense, the ability to protect. Alit, or the clan, the chosen family they called their own, those they were willing to kill and die for. Mando'a, the language, spoken throughout the Mando diaspora. Mandalore, their leader, who they would rally to when called. An Vaknulium Mich, the teaching chant closed. All help us survive. Between that and his Jedi training, Anakin had plenty to keep him busy until he qualified for field missions. In all, Obi-Wan and Anakin remained in the temple for a few months after Obi-Wan took Anakin as his padawan. Partly it was to complete Anakin's current coursework. Mostly, though, it was to build Anakin a fully powered lightsaber, and then give him the time to become accustomed to the more deadly weapon and learn some more advanced combat tactics. Anakin was already proficient in Shicho, so Obi-Wan began teaching him the introductory exercises to the other forms, watching carefully to see which one fit Anakin best. Anakin would eventually learn all the forms save Vapad, as all Padawans did, before specializing in the one he chose as he grew into his full height and strength as an adolescent. Nearly a year after becoming Obi-Wan's Padawan, Anakin could perform the exercises with a certain amount of proficiency, and it tested out of his current course load, so they were placed on the mission rotation. It didn't take long for them to be sent out. Over the past few years, the new Chancellor had leaned heavily on the Jedi, and missions had come in fast and frequent as a result. Bail Antilles had been elected a few years after the Naboo crisis, when Chancellor Olarom had limped out of office under a cloud of suspicion. Chancellor Antilles' promise to combat crime and corruption had been well received. Following through had the Jedi investigating even the barest hint of conflict, and sometimes intervention resulted in disagreements flaring into violence. Remembering how his cautions before arriving at Galadron had helped that mission, Obi-Wan was determined to do his best to research everything thoroughly when he was sent out, especially once Anakin began coming along with him. Their first missions, if things went to plan, would likely be diplomatic or ceremonial, low-risk situations as Anakin acclimated to life as a padawan and gained some experience as a field Jedi, while Obi-Wan learned how to shepherd his charge outside of the temple's walls. Obi-Wan's own training with first Master Jin and then Master Dooku had been highly irregular as he jumped from one high-risk situation to the next. While it had ensured he learned fast, Obi-Wan rather hoped Anakin's first years of training as a Padawan were a bit more serene.